to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the fifth Sunday after Epiphany, also known as Lectionary 5, which this year falls on the 7th of February.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, our deep dive today is about the omnipresence of God. Omni meaning everything, presence meaning, being there, not birthday or Christmas presents. The idea that God is everywhere. Now, I've been told by the parents of the children involved that one of my most effective children's sermons I ever gave, which maybe isn't saying a lot, I don't know, was one where I talked about how God had truly created everything, and I listed a whole bunch of very different stuff, and one of the things that I listed was mosquitoes. God created mosquitoes. This apparently blew the minds of these kids. And, they were talking about it all week, and I love it when kids have that response, but, there is no controlling when that happens,
Mm-hmm.
You never know how they're going to respond to stuff like that. But if I can try to blow your mind for a moment, let's really think for a second about what the consequences of God truly being everywhere is, omnipresence. Because much like God created everything, we also believe that God is truly everywhere. From mansions to shacks, from babies being born to the rooms where COVID patients are dying. From a beautiful sunset to caves that are filled with bat guano and water that is filled with bacteria and parasites. Yes, that example is in there because I once read a extremely visceral and vivid description of a cave like that.
I believe you.
And there are some places where it's easy to find God. Raise your hand if you've ever had someone tell you that they like finding God in sunsets or nature.
Which is accurate.
That's fine. I find God there too. That's totally cool. It's just, the thing about faith is that when it matures, you start seeing God in the more difficult places also. Mm-hmm. Not just in beauty, but also in the places where it's harder to imagine that God is there. But the truth is that God never abandons us. And so even when we are struggling, even when we are in pain, even when we are stretched to our limits or past them, God is there. And one of my favorite ways to remember this is that the concept of some place that is truly God-forsaken, which is a phrase that gets used sometimes, that's fictional. It's not true. There's no such place.
Yeah, I was thinking about God's omnipresence, and there's actually a great series. I don't think they're actually a series because they don't all match, but there are kids' books that are like, what is God's name? What does God look like? Where does God live? So, sure. If you need a kid's book, Where Does God Live? For this one would be great. But sure. I was thinking about this, and I'm in a spiritual direction for caring professionals group that meets about every other week. And one of the leaders of the group, Christine, is Jewish, and she talked about one time when we were meeting, she talked about a concept in Judaism being that God is in everything. So that includes God being in suffering, which is also what we're talking about with Christianity and with our faith. And the delicate piece of that is that it's not that God causes suffering, but right. That God is present in suffering, which for those of us who are Christians, we call this the theology of the cross, right? That we see God present in suffering, yes. Because we see Jesus on the cross, and that is the epitome of suffering. And so we know that God is with us when we suffer. Not that God causes it. I think I frequently pray about God's tears joining our tears, that God cries with us when we cry, and that is part of how we think about God's omnipresence.
Yes. However, if you are used to thinking of attributes of God as being superpowers, Emily and I were talking before we started recording this episode, and we've decided this would be a terrible superpower. This would not be a fun one. No, thank you. I really don't want to be in all the places. Nope. Thank you, God, for being there, but not. But nope. No, I'm not signing up for it.
No, I like limited location. I am an introvert. I do not want to be everywhere.
being in two places at once, that would be really handy sometimes, but everywhere, no.
Or being able to, apparate, sure,
yes.
and get to
Teleporting,
other places really quickly, yes, but, like, I'm
No
an
switching.
introvert. I wonder if extroverts would be like, yes! I should ask my roommate sometime.
Cave filled with bat guano and water filled with bacteria and parasites, I'm just saying. So
yeah, that's true.
Like, there are scientists who love places like that, nature enthusiasts and so forth, and that's fine, but I'm not one of them.
That's fair. As we dive into the readings for this episode, our first reading for this episode is Isaiah chapter 40, verses 21 through 31. God reminds the Israelites who are exiled that they don't need to worry about God getting tired or worn out. After all, God created the universe.
Yay.
So one of the themes in this passage that comes up a couple times is the like, didn't you know? Right? We hear it, and it's the way that Isaiah states it is, have you not known? Have you not heard? And it's repeated a couple times. It reminded me of the Doctor Who episode in season 6. So throughout season 6, we kind of learn who River Song is, but there's an episode where she names the Doctor, and we don't actually hear it, but
well, no, that would ruin the suspense,
right? But it's the only time that the Doctor is ever named, because the Doctor's name can never be said. So this idea of didn't you know? No, of course not, because the Doctor couldn't say. So the answer to God's question in the Doctor Who sense is no, didn't know. But yeah, I think it's this perfect naming and not knowing and knowing, and when things are revealed.
It also reminds me of a fairly common storytelling trope, which is often known as you know, Bob. When a author or a writer wants to put in a bit of world building expansion kind of thing, they'll have someone start a lecture on recent history or how this piece of science works or whatever with as you know, because everyone in this universe knows that, and then go on and explain the thing.
It's like mansplaining.
Not quite, because they're just they're telling the audience who is part of a different universe and doesn't know
but
that.
the character is mansplaining.
In character, yeah, in the universe it might feel like mansplaining to whoever the person who's listening, but it's something you see in young writers especially, and after a while people figure out more nuanced and more interesting ways of sharing that kind of information, but it can be fun. But the phrase as you know, Bob, is now stuck in my head for the rest of my life. So
nice. Then in verse 22, when we hear about God who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, it just reminded me vividly of outer space, right? And thinking about the pictures of the Milky Way at night. As someone who grew up in the mountains of Colorado, I think about, when I think of the Milky Way, it's this, paler area of the sky, right? Where it's just kind of this, not gray, but, that sort of grayish, bluish. It's just,
because
you
there
can
are
see
so many
all the
more
stars.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Compared to, with light pollution and stuff. But then there are other places where it's actually, dark spots on Earth where you can see the full Milky Way with all of the stars, plus the gas that blocks some of the light. And
yeah,
it's just amazing. This, beautiful... That's what I think about when I think about the heavens stretched out like a curtain or spread out like a tent to live in.
See, whereas I read that verse and my immediate reaction was to say, this does not mean that God is one of the planet builders from Magrathea in the series Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, if God wants to, God might in fact choose to look like a mouse sometimes, but God is certainly a lot less unpleasant than those planet builders were, and definitely does not want to experiment on you.
Yeah.
Just a heads up, in case you were worried.
I was not worried, but now I am.
Well, God looking like a mouse could be fun. Yeah,
it's true. I mean, we did just talk about God being omnipresent.
And therefore, yes, in mice as well. Yeah.
Yep.
When we reach verse 23, we hear, God who brings princes to naught, who makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. God can do this, yes, That doesn't mean that God is like an alien invasion force, like in the first couple of episodes of David Tennant's run as Doctor Who, where only the Doctor can save the Earth because human rulers are basically powerless in that situation. Of course, the Doctor winds up saving the Earth through a sword fight because that totally makes sense. But the human rulers are basically all stripped of their power because the alien invasion force is so powerful. However, I also read this verse, and in another nerdy reference, it makes me wonder if this was something that inspired Mary's Magnificat in the Gospel of Luke. So it definitely sounds like it.
Interesting. I always connect Mary's Magnificat with Hannah's song in Samuel, 1 Samuel.
That too, yes. But I like the thought that Mary would have, known quite a bit of the Hebrew Scriptures. So.
Yes. I imagine she did. I mean, she summarizes them well, for sure.
Yeah. I also like to think that she was totally the kid in the ancient Jewish equivalent of Sunday school that asked all the hard questions.
Yes. Yep. That just makes me think about my ordination and the children's sermon that my youth director gave about the questions that I asked. Something about poop on the ark. Asking the real tough questions here. So as we get to the end of this passage, we get to a very well-known verse. I know for many of us, we hear it at funerals. I know one of the passages and songs from my grandmother's funeral, but...
Also high school graduation for athletes, especially. My husband works for a yearbook company.
Interesting. So verse 31 says, "But those who wait for God shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." And it called to mind for me, and like spirit of full disclosure slash shout out to River and Pace and Susanna, 2 out of the 3 of whom have been guests on our podcast, and the 3rd of whom will probably at some point be a guest on our podcast, for helping me with these last night when I was having Sunday night brain and not able to think very well. So a lot of these references are ones that like make sense to me and I know, but also were sparked by them, including this, that the renewing of strength and mounting up, walking and not fainting was reminiscent of what Gandalf says in Lord of the Rings: Two Towers to Aragorn before they head to before they part ways, and Aragorn goes with the people of Rohan to Helm's Deep, and Gandalf says, "At dawn on the 3rd day, look to the east." And it's like literally dawn on the 3rd day. They're exhausted. They're about to lose the whole thing. Yeah. And Gandalf's words come back to Aragorn, and he looks to the east, and as the sun is like peeking over the horizon and backlighting, Gandalf the White comes on the horse, and then behind him, like, all of the men of Rohan who were previously, like, banished because of Wormtongue and all those things, but that in the midst of the weariness, help comes.
Our second reading for this episode is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 through 23. Paul is not called to use the strength the gospel gives him to make himself more powerful or more rich, but to use it to spread the gospel to more and different people.
So one of the themes for this passage is this idea of meeting people where they're at. That's what Paul's talking about a lot, of showing up in the ways that they're showing up. And so Pace brought this up with Batman, but I think it works also for Arrow in the CW series, that like there's the billionaire who has one image of who he is, and not in the very first seasons of the Arrow, but in later seasons, once Oliver has kind of established himself as a good rich guy, which I mean, it's debatable if any billionaire could actually be good, because people are poor, and that in and of itself is enough reason to not be a billionaire. But the idea is like, so he meets people where they're at, in the like billionaire trying to, or like the politician trying to inspire the good of the community and work for the good of the community, but then also at night he like is the hero fighting bad guys and being a vigilante. So it's these like different ways of meeting people where they're at that are common for a lot of superheroes who are like, I have to hide my identity, so I will be this to these people and this to these people.
So then that's why Clark Kent is a journalist.
Yeah. And Supergirl.
When we reach verse 16, we hear, "If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me." And this concept is basically the foundation of the movie Saved, which I suppose probably came out several years ago now.
Oh my gosh, that movie is
but I love that movie so much.
So funny.
Being Christian doesn't make you better than non-Christians. It doesn't mean you get to be arrogant about being a Christian. That's not what Christianity is about. It's about humility and caring about others as God cares for us, as a few of the main characters in Saved learn throughout the course of the movie.
They definitely don't know it at the beginning.
Goodness knows no. Yeah.
So in verse 17, I was thinking about the ways that Paul says, "For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission," and the idea of commissioning someone to do something. And the ways that, like, Supergirl, especially in the first season, has this sense of being commissioned to be Supergirl against whatever her family and community say, because they're speaking out of worry and fear for her, but she is committed to doing it not because of the publicity or getting paid or any of that, but because it is her call to do.
In verse 21, we hear, "To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law." Okay, so who is outside the law? Well, not President Bartlett from West Wing, according to one fan and TV writer, Yelena War, whose tweet became viral when she tweeted a possible script for how would Bartlett react to January 6th.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Check it out. It's fabulous. She wrote this whole script. There are several scenes, and we'll put a link in the description and also on social media with the whole script in one document, basically. But it is super interesting, and I know you haven't seen this yet, Emily, but I'm going to spoil the ending to share this in a way that won't completely spoil the story for you. Bartlett is willing to face accountability in a way that some other people are not. And it's actually pretty surprising the way he chooses to go about it. She did a very nice job with that. I realize it's not technically canon, but we at Nerds at Church are also a fan of fanfiction. So
yay, fanfiction. Well, and I thought you were going to talk about Bartlett when he opens himself to accountability for having not revealed his multiple sclerosis diagnosis to
he does that too. Yes, that is actually
he
canon.
gets a congregational censure, I think, something. But
congressional, not congregational.
He gets a congressional censure or something.
Yes. I don't know if his congregation had feelings about that. They might have. So
that's true. He was Catholic.
Yeah, and yet didn't know what the name of the last book of the Bible was. But whatever. Moving on. I'm still bitter.
Okay,
he called it Revelations.
I know.
Many times.
But think about how many people don't know that Revelation is just singular.
Yes, but Bartlett was canonically a very active Catholic who read his Bible a lot. So
right, because
it bothers me.
Because Martin Sheen is a Catholic who reads his Bible a lot, and he clearly didn't know. So
that bothers me. I have a pet peeve. I'm allowed.
You're allowed to have a pet peeve, but you're being super judgmental about something that is super common among even pastors.
But it shouldn't be.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, that bothers me too. So
it bothers me more about pastors than people.
Well, yes, that's fair. Or President Bartlett presents himself as someone who knows the Bible quite well, and therefore I think being able to read the table of contents is anyway. Moving on. Yes, I'm being judgmental.
Yep. It's hard to combat everything else in all of social media and culture calls it revelations. So it's hard to
I know.
combat that. Just saying.
No, I have two things that I tend to go after as pet peeves of if you're going to claim to know Christianity, then you really should know this. And one of them is the last book of the Bible, is singular. And the other one is there are several numberings of the Ten Commandments, but so often people will say the first commandment is, and that is just not, like, in any of the numbering systems, that is not the first commandment. And or, they said it incorrectly. And so that's why I insist on teaching my confirmation students the Ten Commandments and having them memorize at least the content of and order of them, if not the exact wording.
Which will come up in Lent.
Yes.
So in verse 22, we hear Paul say, "To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some," which is a great recipe for burnout.
Yep.
One of my pet peeves is when someone, usually in like a eulogy or a funeral sermon, is lifted up as like never saying no, as always showing up whenever asked. And it's like, actually, that's really bad boundaries, and that is not helpful for anybody, and it probably means that they were over-functioning.
Yeah, and exhausted, and not having great relationships, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or it means that Paul is really Mystique from X-Men, who can literally be any person.
Who also didn't have great boundaries, and
also
had some really bad relationships, and, occasionally was a little evil. So, yeah.
But also, like, in a practical sense, can be, in fact, all people at some time.
That would be a much better superpower than omnipresence, although still tricky.
Yeah, I would much rather have Mystique's superpower than omnipresence. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 39. Jesus and the disciples go to Simon's home. Simon's mother-in-law is healed, as well as many townspeople. After finding a quiet place to pray in the morning, Jesus tells the disciples it's time to go to the next town so he can share the good news there.
So, before we get to our theme for this passage, Pastor Emily and I have a challenge for you. Who is it in this passage who is doing the healing? Is it Simon? Is it Jesus? Is it some unknown entity who's never actually mentioned, who happens to be male? Because all we get in this is pronouns. And when I read the passage, it looks to me, naturally, like Simon is the one who heals his mother-in-law, because of course they would tell Simon that his mother-in-law is sick. But then Jesus is clearly the one who's healing all the other townspeople, because he's the new person, he's the one people always bring sick people to.
But if you ask me, they tell Jesus that Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and he heals her, and then he heals the people throughout the town, throughout the whole city, because that's what Jesus does. And it's the beginning of Mark, and so it's before he has at all sent the disciples to go out on their own to do anything.
This is why occasionally using people's names in addition to pronouns is helpful.
Right? That'd be a wonder.
And, we know a lot about the Bible, we don't know everything, because you can't really prove it either way. So.
Mm-hmm. Unless you would like to make an argument for us either way, or go back to the Greek and tell us what the Greek says, which we could technically figure out, but I don't
pretty sure that the Greek also uses pronouns.
Probably, but you never know. Occasionally.
Yeah. They do switch things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, let us know what you think. So one of the themes in this passage is obviously healing. Not the same kind of healing as in Battlestar Galactica, when the Cylon human fetus of Boomer and Hilo, the blood from that fetus saves President Roslin from her cancer, but healing nevertheless.
Yeah, that sounds like there's a lot more to that story than...
I mean, since, Cylons are despised by all of the humans, and there's a lot of...
Aren't they also machines?
Yes, but they've, become... So
like sentient machines.
They're sentient
like
machines, but they also have, become more like humans. So they look like humans, and they bleed like humans, and they can die like humans, except then they get resurrected if they're close enough to their resurrection ship. But...
Awkward.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but apparently they can also, have sex and make a baby with a human. Not by themselves, but with a human.
Right. Awkward. Okay.
Yeah, the baby was just born where I'm at, so I don't know how it's going to develop. It's a secret.
Okay.
Keep it secret. Keep it safe. I gotta quote Lord of the Rings again, somehow. Lest people think that I'm getting more into Battlestar Galactica than Lord of the Rings. Anywho, in verse 30, we hear that Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. And as we know from the Hunger Games, fever means infection, which is what Peeta had in the first Hunger Games when he was almost dead and dying.
Yes. To be fair, I think we knew that before the Hunger Games.
I mean, true, and one of the clearest examples is the Hunger Games.
Yes, in fiction.
Yes.
In verse 32, we hear, that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. I'm just going to skip over the possessed with demons part. We talked about that last episode. And move right on to, this passage reminds me of the Firefly episode, Safe, where the doctor, Simon, and his sister, River, are kidnapped by a town who needs a doctor. And they bring him to the place where they keep all the people who need a doctor. Sort of a doctor's office, not really.
A hospital?
I mean, it's a house with sick people in it. They don't really have equipment or anything.
I was trying to remember.
So, sort of. But I guess an infirmary would be a good word for it. So it's kind of backwards. They bring the doctor, the healer, to the sick people instead of bringing the sick people to the healer. But it also works. He heals them anyway, as best he can, until his sister is accused of being a witch, and then they try to burn her at the stake, and Simon gets a little distracted, as one does.
Yeah, because why would you want to just let your sister be burned at the stake? That seems like a bad idea.
And then he tries to get himself burned at the stake, and it all gets more complicated. And then they get to be, the rest of the crew gets to be big heroes and save the day.
Woohoo! Yeah. When we get to verse 34, we hear that Jesus would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And that is reminiscent of the Ood in Doctor Who were also not permitted to speak, though I think that's a crueler thing for the Ood, but they weren't allowed to sing their songs and speak. They were made to keep silent.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
But once they do sing, it's very pretty.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 37, we hear, when they found him, they said to him, everyone is searching for you. Okay, yes, I'm sure that that's what they said. But I have to wonder, given my personal experiences, if it was really everyone who was searching for Jesus, or was it just a couple of people who the disciples thought were important that sent the disciples out looking for Jesus? Like, sometimes when somebody says everyone is doing something, really, they just mean a couple of people that they happen to think are important. Sometimes everyone means that one person thinks this, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But, if a Star Trek captain wants to see you, everyone is probably looking for you. But it's not because everyone wants to see you, it's because the captain wants to see you.
So is Simon a Star Trek captain or a red shirt?
Well, Simon's getting sent out. Shirt. Yeah, so probably
not a
also
captain.
Jesus is definitely not the captain in this case. But maybe it's Simon's mother-in-law.
I could see her being a captain.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Transfiguration with our special guest, Emily Ann Garcia. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. Plus, we're now on the Our Bible app, so you can find us there as well.
Yay!
If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.